One of the most powerful ways wise Christians respond to narcissists is by refusing to take every offense personally. This sounds simple, but in practice it requires tremendous spiritual maturity, emotional discipline, and a deep understanding of one's identity in God. Narcissistic individuals often have a way of making others feel small, confused, guilty, or responsible for problems they did not create. Their words can be sharp, their criticism can be relentless, and their behavior can leave people constantly questioning themselves. Many individuals become trapped in a cycle where they absorb every negative comment and carry every accusation as though it were an undeniable truth. Wise Christians choose a different path. They recognize that while hurtful words may come from another person, they do not have to become permanent labels attached to their lives. When someone constantly criticizes, manipulates, or dismisses you, the natural tendency is to internalize their behavior. You begin to wonder if maybe they are right. You question your judgment, your character, and even your value. Over time, this can create emotional exhaustion and spiritual discouragement. A wise Christian understands that not every opinion spoken about them deserves a place in their heart. They learn to filter what they hear through the truth of God's word rather than through the emotions of the moment. Instead of immediately accepting every accusation, they pause and examine it carefully. They ask whether the criticism is constructive or simply another attempt to control, shame, or dominate. This perspective changes everything. Rather than allowing another person's words to determine their worth, they remember what God has already declared about them. They remember that they were created intentionally and with purpose. They remember that their value was established by God long before anyone formed an opinion about them. Because of this foundation, they become less vulnerable to manipulation. Hurtful words may still sting, but they no longer have the power to define who they are. Many narcissists thrive on emotional reactions. They often seek to provoke responses because emotional turmoil gives them a sense of influence and control. They may exaggerate faults, question motives, or repeatedly bring up past mistakes. Their goal is often not understanding, but dominance. Wise Christians begin to recognize these patterns. They understand that every accusation does not require a defense, and every criticism does not require an emotional response. Instead of reacting impulsively, they choose to remain calm. They learn that their peace is far too valuable to surrender to every negative comment that comes their way. This does not mean they become indifferent or emotionally numb. It simply means they refuse to give another person authority over their emotional well-being. They understand that people often speak from their own wounds, insecurities, fears, and unresolved struggles. A narcissistic person's harsh words frequently reveal more about their internal condition than about the person they are targeting. Recognizing this truth allows wise believers to create healthy emotional distance between another person's behavior and their own identity. There is also great wisdom in understanding that some people will never be satisfied regardless of what you do. You can work harder, give more, explain yourself repeatedly, and make countless sacrifices, yet they will continue finding reasons to criticize. Wise Christians eventually realize that seeking approval from someone determined to withhold it is an exhausting and never-ending pursuit. Instead of dedicating their energy to winning acceptance that may never come, they focus on living faithfully before God. Their goal shifts from pleasing everyone to honoring the one who truly knows their heart. This mindset creates freedom. Freedom comes when you stop carrying responsibilities that do not belong to you. It comes when you realize you are not responsible for another person's inability to appreciate your efforts. You are not responsible for fixing every misunderstanding, calming every unreasonable demand, or meeting every impossible expectation. Wise Christians understand that while they are called to walk in love, they are not called to carry the emotional burdens created by someone else's unhealthy behavior. Prayer becomes especially important in this process. Instead of replaying hurtful conversations over and over in their minds, they bring those wounds before God. They ask Him for wisdom, discernment, and healing. They seek His perspective rather than relying solely on their emotions. Through prayer, they gain clarity. They begin to see situations more accurately. They become less controlled by fear and more guided by faith. The peace that comes from God's presence helps them remain steady, even when facing difficult people. Another important important aspect of refusing to take every offense personally is recognizing the difference between conviction and condemnation. Conviction from God leads to growth, repentance, and transformation. Condemnation from unhealthy individuals often leads to shame, confusion, and hopelessness. Wise Christians learn how to distinguish between the two. They remain humble enough to accept genuine correction when needed, but they refuse to embrace false guilt that is designed to manipulate or control them. Over time, this approach strengthens emotional resilience. Instead of being shaken by every negative interaction, they develop stability. Instead of constantly defending themselves, they become secure in who they are. Instead of living under the weight of another person's opinions, they walk confidently in God's truth. Their confidence is not rooted in pride or self-sufficiency, but in the assurance that their identity is anchored in something far greater than human approval. As this wisdom grows, they become increasingly difficult to manipulate. Fear loses its grip, anxiety begins to fade, the need for constant validation starts to disappear. They no longer spend their days trying to prove their worth because they already know where their worth comes from. This inner security allows them to respond with grace rather than hostility, wisdom rather than impulsiveness, and peace rather than panic. Their emotional stability becomes a reflection of their spiritual maturity, and their ability to remain grounded in truth protects them from becoming entangled in cycles of control, criticism, and confusion that so often accompany relationships with narcissistic individuals. Another secret way wise Christians respond to narcissists is through the practice of holy restraint. In a world that often encourages immediate reactions, instant responses, and emotional retaliation, holy restraint stands out as a powerful expression of spiritual maturity. It is the ability to remain calm when provoked, to think before speaking, and to allow wisdom rather than emotion to guide one's actions. This kind of restraint is not weakness, passivity, or fear. It is strength that has been surrendered to God's control. Wise Christians understand that just because they feel something strongly does not mean they must act on it immediately. Narcissistic individuals often know how to trigger emotional responses in others. They may use criticism, blame, guilt, exaggeration, or manipulation to create conflict. They frequently push emotional buttons because strong reactions can give them a sense of control over a situation. When someone reacts impulsively with anger, frustration, or desperation, the focus often shifts away from the original issue and becomes centered on the reaction itself. Wise Christians recognize this pattern. They understand that emotional reactions can sometimes become the very trap that keeps conflict alive. When confronted with harsh words, unfair accusations, or deliberate provocations, the natural human instinct is often to defend oneself immediately. Most people feel a strong urge to explain, argue, correct, or prove their innocence. However, wise believers understand that reacting in the heat of the moment rarely produces the desired outcome. Strong emotions can cloud judgment, distort communication, and create consequences that linger long after the conversation has ended. Holy restraint allows a person to pause before responding. That pause creates space for wisdom to enter the situation. This restraint begins internally before it is ever visible externally. It starts with learning how to manage emotions instead of being controlled by them. Wise Christians acknowledge their feelings honestly. They do not pretend that hurtful words do not hurt. They do not deny disappointment, frustration, or sadness. Instead, they recognize those emotions while refusing to let them become the master of their behavior. They understand that feelings are real, but feelings are not always reliable guides for decision-making. Prayer plays a significant role in developing this kind of restraint. When emotions begin to rise, wise Christians learn to bring those emotions before God. Rather than immediately responding to a difficult person, they first seek divine wisdom. They ask God for discernment, patience, and understanding. This practice helps them separate temporary emotional impulses from lasting spiritual wisdom. Over time, prayer becomes a source of stability that allows them to remain grounded even in highly stressful situations. One of the greatest benefits of holy restraint is that it prevents unnecessary escalation. Narcissistic individuals often thrive in environments filled with chaos and emotional intensity. Arguments can become opportunities for them to gain attention, shift blame, or manipulate circumstances. Wise Christians recognize that participating in every conflict often gives greater power to the conflict itself. By refusing to react impulsively, they interrupt the cycle. They decline invitations into needless drama and choose a different path. This does not mean remaining silent in every situation. Holy restraint is not the absence of truth, it is the careful timing and delivery of truth. Wise believers understand that the right words spoken at the wrong time can still create unnecessary damage. They learn to consider not only what should be said, but also when and how it should be said. Sometimes the most effective response is immediate clarity. Other times, the wisest response is waiting until emotions settle and perspective returns. There are moments when narcissistic individuals may deliberately distort facts, challenge motives, or make accusations designed to provoke defensiveness. In those moments, holy restraint helps believers avoid becoming consumed by the need to win every argument. Wise Christians understand that not every misunderstanding can be corrected and not every false accusation can be disproven. Some people are not genuinely seeking truth. They are seeking control. Recognizing this distinction allows believers to conserve their emotional energy for battles that truly matter. Holy restraint also protects a person's testimony and character. Emotional reactions made in moments of frustration often lead to regret. Words spoken in anger can damage relationships, create misunderstandings, and leave lasting wounds. Wise Christians understand that their actions reflect not only upon themselves, but also upon the faith they profess. They desire their responses to demonstrate the fruit of spiritual maturity rather than the impulses of temporary emotion. This commitment encourages them to exercise patience even when patience feels difficult. Developing restraint requires practice because human nature often desires immediate relief from emotional discomfort. When hurt, people naturally want to defend themselves. When criticized, they want to explain. When attacked, they want to strike back. Holy restraint challenges these instincts by teaching believers to prioritize wisdom over impulse. The goal is not suppression, but self-control. Self-control allows a person to choose responses intentionally rather than reacting automatically. Over time, this discipline produces remarkable strength. Individuals who practice holy restraint become less vulnerable to manipulation because they are no longer easily controlled by emotional triggers. They learn to observe situations more objectively. They become skilled at recognizing unhealthy patterns and responding thoughtfully rather than impulsively. Their calm presence often diffuses situations that might otherwise spiral into greater conflict. Another important aspect of restraint is accepting that silence can sometimes communicate strength more effectively than endless words. Narcissistic individuals may attempt to draw others into circular arguments where no resolution is possible. Wise Christians learn that continuing such conversations often serves no productive purpose. Instead of feeling obligated to engage indefinitely, they recognize when a discussion has become unproductive. Their willingness to step back reflects confidence rather than weakness. As spiritual maturity deepens, holy restraint becomes less about avoiding conflict and more about trusting God. Wise Christians understand that they do not have to control every outcome. They do not have to defend themselves against every criticism or correct every false perception. Their security rests in knowing that God sees what others may misunderstand. This trust enables them to remain calm when circumstances tempt them toward anxiety or frustration. The practice of holy restraint ultimately transforms how believers navigate difficult relationships. Rather than being driven by emotion, they become guided by wisdom. Rather than reacting to every provocation, they choose responses that align with their values and faith. Rather than allowing conflict to dictate their behavior, they maintain control over their words, attitudes, and actions. This quiet strength becomes a powerful testimony of spiritual maturity, demonstrating that true power is not found in overpowering others, but in mastering oneself under the guidance of God. Another secret way wise Christians respond to narcissists is by establishing and maintaining godly boundaries. This principle is often misunderstood because many people mistakenly believe that setting boundaries is selfish, unloving, or contrary to Christian faith. Yet throughout life, wisdom teaches that healthy relationships require healthy limits. Boundaries are not barriers designed to keep everyone out. They are safeguards that protect what God has entrusted to us. Wise Christians understand that while they are called to love others, they are not called to surrender their peace, dignity, emotional well-being, or spiritual health to the control of another person. Narcissistic individuals often resist boundaries because boundaries limit their ability to manipulate, dominate, or control situations. They may expect unlimited access to your time, energy, attention, emotions, and resources. They often become uncomfortable when someone begins to say no, express personal needs, or establish clear expectations. For this reason, many believers find boundary setting especially difficult when dealing with narcissistic personalities. The moment they begin protecting themselves, they may face guilt, criticism, accusations of selfishness, or attempts to pressure them into abandoning their limits. Wise Christians recognize that not every demand deserves compliance. They understand that saying yes to everything can actually become harmful. When people continually sacrifice their own emotional and spiritual health to satisfy unhealthy expectations, resentment, exhaustion, and discouragement often follow. God never intended for his people to live under constant emotional pressure from individuals who refuse to respect healthy limits. Wisdom teaches believers how to love others without losing themselves in the process. One reason boundaries are so important is that narcissistic individuals frequently blur the lines of personal responsibility. They may expect others to solve problems they created, manage emotions they refuse to address, or accept blame for situations they caused. Over time, this can create unhealthy patterns where one person carries responsibilities that do not belong to them. Wise Christians learn to distinguish between compassion and unhealthy responsibility. They can care about someone's struggles without becoming responsible for fixing every problem in that person's life. Boundaries also protect emotional energy. Every person has limited emotional resources. Constant conflict, criticism, manipulation, and drama can slowly drain those resources until a person feels depleted. Wise believers understand that emotional energy is a gift from God that should be invested wisely. They recognize that spending every day managing unnecessary conflict leaves little strength for family, ministry, personal growth, and their relationship with God. By setting healthy limits, they preserve the energy needed to fulfill their God-given responsibilities. Many believers struggle with boundaries because they confuse love with unlimited tolerance. They assume that being loving means accepting any behavior, no matter how harmful it becomes. Wise Christians understand that true love does not ignore destructive patterns. Love values truth as well as grace. It is possible to care deeply about someone while refusing to participate in unhealthy behavior. In fact, boundaries often communicate truth more clearly than endless accommodation ever could. When narcissistic individuals repeatedly violate trust, wise Christians do not simply pretend that nothing happened. They acknowledge reality honestly. They recognize patterns rather than focusing only on isolated incidents. They understand that repeated behavior reveals important truths about the health of a relationship. Instead of making endless excuses for destructive conduct, they respond with wisdom and clarity. This does not mean they become harsh or unforgiving. It means they stop ignoring reality. A healthy boundary often begins with clear communication. Wise believers learn to express their expectations calmly and respectfully. They do not rely on hints, assumptions, or silent frustration. They communicate honestly about what behavior is acceptable and what behavior is not. While narcissistic individuals may resist these conversations, wise Christians understand that clarity reduces confusion and creates opportunities for healthier interactions. One of the challenges of boundary setting is accepting that not everyone will respond positively. Narcissistic individuals often interpret boundaries as personal rejection rather than healthy self-respect. They may react with anger, guilt trips, manipulation, or attempts to regain control. This response can make believers question whether they are doing the right thing. Wise Christians prepare themselves for this possibility. They understand that another person's negative reaction does not automatically mean the boundary is wrong. Boundaries require consistency. A limit that changes every time pressure is applied is no longer a true boundary. Narcissistic individuals often test limits repeatedly, looking for opportunities to regain influence. Wise Christians remain steady. They understand that consistency communicates seriousness and builds respect over time. Even when maintaining boundaries feels uncomfortable, they recognize that inconsistency often leads back to the same unhealthy patterns they are trying to escape. Another important aspect of godly boundaries is recognizing personal limitations. Wise Christians understand that they are human beings with finite strength, wisdom, and emotional capacity. They cannot meet every need, solve every problem, or satisfy every expectation. Accepting these limitations is not failure, it is humility. It allows them to depend on God rather than attempting to become everything for everyone. Boundaries also create space for accountability. When there are no consequences for harmful behavior, unhealthy patterns often continue unchecked. Wise believers understand that allowing someone to repeatedly violate limits without consequence can unintentionally enable destructive behavior. Healthy boundaries communicate that actions have results and that relationships function best when mutual respect exists. Perhaps most importantly, boundaries protect spiritual health. Constant exposure to manipulation, criticism, and emotional turmoil can distract believers from their relationship with God. It can consume attention, create anxiety, and weaken spiritual focus. Wise Christians understand that guarding their hearts is a biblical responsibility. They recognize that maintaining spiritual strength sometimes requires creating distance from influences that continually undermine peace and growth. As believers mature in wisdom, they begin to realize that boundaries are not acts of selfishness, but acts of stewardship. God has entrusted them with their time, energy, emotions, relationships, and spiritual well-being. Protecting those gifts is not a lack of love, it is an expression of wisdom. Through healthy boundaries, they learn to love without enabling, serve without being exploited, give without being depleted, and remain compassionate without surrendering their God-given peace and purpose. Another secret way wise Christians respond to narcissists is by refusing to spend their lives explaining themselves endlessly. This principle may seem simple at first, but it is one of the most difficult lessons to learn when dealing with manipulative and controlling individuals. Most people naturally want to be understood. They want others to know their intentions, appreciate their efforts, and recognize their sincerity. When misunderstandings occur, they feel compelled to clarify. When accused unfairly, they feel the need to defend themselves. When their motives are questioned, they want to provide evidence of their innocence. While this desire is understandable, wise Christians eventually discover that not every person is genuinely interested in understanding them. Narcissistic individuals often create situations where explanations become endless. A conversation may begin with a simple disagreement, but it quickly turns into a complicated cycle of accusations, justifications, and repeated defenses. No matter how clearly the explanation is given, it never seems to be enough. One answer leads to another question. One clarification leads to another accusation. One defense leads to another challenge. The goalposts constantly move. What appeared to be a search for understanding becomes an exhausting process with no finish line. Wise Christians learn to recognize this pattern. They begin to understand that there is a significant difference between someone seeking understanding and someone seeking control. A person who genuinely wants understanding listens, considers information, and seeks resolution. A narcissistic individual may appear to be seeking answers, but often they are looking for leverage. They may use explanations against you later, twist your words, or continue demanding further justification regardless of how thoroughly you respond. Once believers recognize this pattern, they begin to approach such conversations differently. One reason endless explaining becomes dangerous is because it places a person's peace in the hands of someone else's approval. When individuals constantly feel obligated to justify every decision, every boundary, every opinion, and every action, they gradually lose confidence in their own judgment. They begin seeking permission to make choices they already have the right to make. They become trapped in a cycle of constantly proving themselves. Wise Christians understand that God did not create them to live under the burden of perpetual self-defense. This realization requires a strong sense of identity. People who know who they are in God are less dependent on universal approval. They understand that not everyone will agree with their decisions. Not everyone will understand their motives. Not everyone will appreciate their efforts. Yet their confidence remains intact because their worth is rooted in something deeper than public opinion. They are guided by conviction rather than constant validation. Narcissistic individuals often exploit the natural desire to be understood. They may intentionally misinterpret statements, distort intentions, or ignore explanations altogether. The more the other person tries to clarify, the more opportunities arise for confusion and manipulation. Wise Christians eventually realize that some conversations are designed not to reach truth, but to maintain control. Continuing to participate in such exchanges only prolongs frustration and emotional exhaustion. This does not mean wise believers become rude, dismissive, or unwilling to communicate. They still value honesty and clarity. They are willing to explain themselves when healthy communication serves a productive purpose. The difference is that they know when enough has been said. They understand that repeating the same explanation 10 different ways rarely changes the mind of someone who has already chosen not to listen. At some point, wisdom recognizes when further discussion is no longer fruitful. Learning this lesson often brings tremendous freedom. Many people spend years trying to convince others of their good intentions. They repeatedly revisit old conflicts, hoping that one more conversation will finally create understanding. They carefully craft explanations, defend decisions, and attempt to correct every misconception. Yet the misunderstanding remains because the issue was never a lack of information. The issue was an unwillingness to receive it. Wise Christians eventually stop carrying the responsibility for another person's refusal to understand. This freedom allows them to conserve emotional energy. Endless explanations consume time, attention, and peace of mind. They keep people mentally trapped in situations long after the conversation has ended. Wise believers recognize that their emotional resources are valuable. Rather than spending those resources on unproductive arguments, they invest them in prayer, personal growth, healthy relationships, and meaningful pursuits. Another important aspect of refusing endless explanations is learning to trust truth. Many believers feel anxious when others misunderstand them. They worry about damaged reputations, false assumptions, or unfair criticism. While these concerns are understandable, wise Christians place greater confidence in God's ability to reveal truth than in their own ability to control perceptions. They understand that no explanation can force another person to see what they refuse to acknowledge. Ultimately, truth does not depend upon universal agreement to remain true. This trust in God creates remarkable stability. Instead of becoming consumed by every misunderstanding, wise believers focus on living with integrity. They allow their actions to support their words. They remain consistent in character. They trust that over time, genuine integrity speaks more loudly than endless self-defense. While false accusations may arise, they refuse to let those accusations dictate their emotional state. There is also humility involved in this approach. Wise Christians understand that they do not have to win every argument to be right. They do not have to convince everyone in order to maintain their convictions. They become comfortable with the reality that some people will continue believing what they want to believe, regardless of the evidence presented. Accepting this truth allows them to release an impossible burden. As spiritual maturity grows, believers learn that peace often requires letting go of the need to be fully understood by everyone. They become secure enough to accept occasional misunderstanding without feeling compelled to launch into endless defenses. They recognize that some people are committed to misunderstanding because misunderstanding serves their agenda. Rather than becoming trapped in a never-ending cycle of explanations, they choose wisdom. Their words become simpler, clearer, and more purposeful. They communicate honestly, but they do not argue endlessly. They speak truth, but they do not chase approval. They offer clarification when appropriate, but they do not surrender their peace to those determined to remain dissatisfied. This confidence reflects a deeper trust in God's guidance and a growing understanding that their responsibility is to live truthfully, not to control every opinion formed about them. Through this wisdom, they escape the exhausting trap of endless justification and discover the freedom that comes from standing firmly in truth without constantly needing to defend it.